Hi, I'm Mr. Otway, and welcome to my crib. Only joking. I'm going to tell you about Eisenhower. I've got to talk a little bit quietly because my lad's in bed, but there's certain things when you're considering how successful Eisenhower's foreign policy was that you need to take into account. The first thing is that when he was running for election, one of the things he managed to get across to the voters was that he was going to be tough on communism. He even used the phrase that he was going to roll back communism. So we know Truman said the Truman Doctrine about containment, protecting free peoples. Roll back communism is something different, because that would suggest that Eisenhower's intention was to push communism out of areas it already was in. That was what he said. In practice, he didn't really do that. It was also important, it is important I should say, to know about his Secretary of State Dulles. Now Dulles was a very important, influential man. He was said on several sources that I've looked at to have been Eisenhower's closest advisor, and he was definitely black or white with communism. There was no grey areas. You were either in the free world or you were against. You were with America or you were against. There's none of this neutrality. He wouldn't accept any of that. And he also spoke quite firmly as an anti-communist. However, although he said this, although Eisenhower, and supported by Secretary of State Dulles, said all of these things about communism, when it came to Hungary, they did very little. So what happened in Hungary is the Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, Stalin died. There was a little bit of infighting in the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev managed to emerge as the leader of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that Khrushchev wanted to do was to give communism a bit of a better name. He thought that Stalin had done things wrong, and so he was willing to be a little bit more lenient with states that the Soviet Union controlled. Puppet states is what you would call places like Hungary, because they were officially independent, but they weren't really puppets. They were, like Sooty. Anyway, what he said, he gave them a bit more freedom, and what the Hungarians did is they got a new leader called Imre Nagy, or Nagy. Is how it looks, it should be said, but it's Nagy, I think. Anyway, Imre Nagy announced that a lot of freedoms for the Hungarian people, which made Moscow, the Soviet Union, be like, hey, what is going on here? This is a bit suspicious. But then the final straw was that Nagy said he was going to withdraw Hungary from the Warsaw Pact. And then the Soviet Union were like, hey, this is not going to happen, not on my watch. So basically the Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary. 30,000 Hungarians died. That's not a small number, that's not a little fight. 30,000, because they fought back. But they were no match for the Soviet Union and the Red Army, who took over Hungary again, and Nagy was shot. And that was the end of that. And the USA did very little about it. They did pay for something called Radio Free Europe, which isn't in the textbook, but I know certainly happened. It's quite a famous thing. They broadcast uncensored radio across Eastern Europe as much as they could, which was kind of a form of propaganda. And on Radio Free Europe, during the Hungarian uprising, there were details of the uprising, where it was taking place, encouragement for Hungarians to join in as well. But that was it. They didn't send any help, didn't send any large quantities of money. There was no weapons being sent. There was no military aid at all. The Hungarians were kind of left to their own fate, even though on the face of it, Eisenhower's administration spoke out against what the Soviet Union were doing. They didn't do anything. So he said roll back communism. Hungary didn't do a lot about it. In Berlin, Khrushchev, Berlin was an embarrassment for the Soviets, because so many people kept trying to leave East Germany to go to West Germany. And the way that they could do it was through Berlin. It was easy for them to get through Berlin because it was an open city and you could travel from east to west Berlin quite easily. It wasn't so easy on the east-west German border, but Berlin, of course, was in the middle of the communist zone. So Khrushchev, to try and get rid of this embarrassment, gave the Allies an ultimatum, a 6-month ultimatum. It was a bit like when your parents might have said when you'd done something wrong in the past, you'd better come in by X time or else. And Khrushchev said there would be dire consequences if the Western Allies hadn't left within 6 months. And the Western Allies promptly ignored that, and Khrushchev had to back down. A bit of a propaganda disaster for Khrushchev and a propaganda victory for the Allies and for Eisenhower, who of course leads the free world. So that was a bit of a victory, but what was a real embarrassment and a bit of a defeat was there was an agreement between Khrushchev and Eisenhower to have a summit, where the leaders would meet, they would chat about things and try to thaw relations out. And that's kind of a sign that things were becoming a little bit less fraught in the Cold War. And it was the Paris summit, and everything was ready there for them to talk, maybe to solve the issues like Berlin, which was costing both sides a lot of money, to solve issues surrounding the East and West and try to improve relations. But on the eve of the conference, an American spy plane was shot down. Oh dear, can you hear that? That's the baby monitor. A spy plane was shot down over Russia. Better go. I'll be back. Now, as a result of this spy plane being shot down, which was a huge embarrassment for the United States, Khrushchev made a big deal of it and refused to attend the conference. So that wasn't so great. There's also an incident over Egypt, and the Middle East comes into play here. And Egypt's part of the Middle East, North Africa, that sort of area. If I give you a bit of a history lesson here, what would be a history teacher? In the 19th century, France and Britain had invested in building the Suez Canal through Egypt. So they'd paid for this canal, which made it quicker for example, Britain to send ships to India, which was part of the British Empire. It was a quicker way around than going all the way around Africa. But there was a revolution in Egypt, and a man called Nasser took control of Egypt and nationalised the Suez Canal, made it Egyptian. And so Britain and France invaded Egypt. Egypt was no match for them, and they pushed them all the way back. But Eisenhower was furious because he'd not been consulted. And he recognised that he needed the support of the Middle East. They were oil-rich, wealthy area of the world. He needed that oil as well. He needed the oil not to be in the hands of the Soviet Union. And he was furious with Britain and France and ordered them to withdraw. And Britain and France had no choice but to do this because the money and the trade and all of the relations with America, they desperately needed. Britain and France were shown from this incident to no longer be a world power. But Eisenhower's main motivation is because he wanted the Middle East to be sort of looking towards America rather than the Soviet Union for an ally. Did it work? Well, not really. A lot of Middle Eastern countries like Egypt and Syria did look to the Soviet Union for their support for their trade as their world superpower that they would rather look to. Although areas like Iran, for example, initially anyway, they would look to America for support. So the Middle East, even in this period, started to splinter into communist or capitalist areas. And Eisenhower's reaction by forcing the British and French back, well, was it wise? I don't know. It's difficult to say because it didn't have a massive impact. Britain and France, well, relations there would have dulled for a little bit, but it was never going to be fatal because Britain and France needed them so much. And there was some influence gained in the Middle East as a result of that. But yeah, it kind of didn't have the amazing results, but it didn't have particularly negative results. But it was Eisenhower taking a firm grip on things and showing that he was the boss, he was in charge of the free world. And finally, in this epic little explanation, China. China had a civil war for many, many years between capitalists and communists, and you can tell whose side America was on, and the communists won. And the capitalist armies had to flee, and where did they go? To an island off China, Taiwan, and they made that their country. And there's still terrible relations to this day between China and Taiwan. But America refused to accept that China was controlled by the communists and recognised the Taiwanese government as the rightful government of the entire country of China. which upset the Chinese. What had also upset the Chinese was the Korean War, which actually was largely Truman's doing, although Eisenhower became president towards the end of the Korean War. Indeed, it was Eisenhower himself who actually had the armistice decided on with the Korean War, and it's been remained divided to this day. But the Korean War, well, it upset the Chinese because it made them think that America was determined to destroy communism wherever it could possibly destroy communism. And was that true? May well have been. Eisenhower wasn't doing anything to make the Chinese think otherwise with the things he was saying in his election promise. But the US interpreted the Korean War as a sign that the Chinese were expansionist and were willing to sponsor the spread of communism throughout the world. Well, they probably were on their own doorstep. It's arguable whether they would have sponsored, say, a communist revolution in the middle of Africa, for example. But anyway, it didn't improve relations between those two countries. And actually, America built military bases in Taiwan, sent the US 7th Fleet, the Navy, part of the Navy, off to the Taiwanese Straits, and generally just sort of said to China, if you try to invade and attack Taiwan, we're there on their side. And so Taiwan managed to remain independent from China and has done till this day. There were two other key incidents, which were China started to fire artillery shells at some Taiwanese islands, and America and Eisenhower hinted to the Chinese in public that if they continued, then he might use atomic bombs. He didn't blatantly say it, but you knew from what he was saying that that's what he was hinting at. And the Chinese and Mao, Chairman Mao, who was the communist leader, backed down. I believe that first happened in 1955, and then 3 years later it happened again in 1958. The Chinese started to shell Taiwanese nationalist islands just off Taiwan, between Taiwan and China, and America hinted on using atomic bombs, and China had to back down. So there's a bit of a mixed bag here, if I was to summarise. Hungary, he didn't really do anything practical, and that was the thing that happened. That happened in 1956. Berlin, he refused to back down. There was the embarrassment of the spy plane being shot down. Suez, he took firm, strong, decisive action, which made him appear like the leader. It made him, and he tried to gain influence in the Middle East with mixed results. And China, he took a firm hand with, and probably maintained Taiwan as an independent island, as an independent country from China. But it set the tone of American, you would say Sino-American relations. That's what you call, it's not Chinese-American relations, Sino-American. It's a fancy term of putting it, and I don't really know why, to be honest. But anyway, it set the tone of really frosty relations between China and America. And that's largely because America were convinced that China was a Soviet puppet. They'd just do whatever the Soviet Union wanted to do. So there you have it, there's Eisenhower. Now you've got to make up your own minds.